and take it away.
Okay, hi everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in our presentation today that we're going to give called Open for Who: Assessing the Accessibility of Open Textbooks. My name is Teresa Schultz. I am the Social Sciences Librarian here at the University of Nevada, Reno.
Hi, and I'm Elena Asabacht. I'm the Health Sciences Librarian at the University of Nevada, Reno.
And we are going to do a Menti poll and just a couple slides. So if you guys all are going, please feel free to, but we'll have the information up in just a moment. Can everyone hear me? Elena, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, just want to make sure. Okay, so just a very quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Elaine and I started a research project at the beginning of this year where we wanted to evaluate a random sample of open textbooks to see how accessible they were. We'll get into the why of this, why it's important, etc. But we do just want to thank the Association of College and Research Libraries, which did give us about a $5,000 grant for our project. And now we're going to go to our poll. We just have a few questions for everyone, and we're already starting to get answers, so thank you so much. We have 3 questions, and it's just going to be rating it from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And the first is, I feel confident in my accessibility knowledge. And then we have, I always make sure my OERs are accessible. And then, one moment, because I just realized the waiting room thing is blocking. I know how to evaluate OERs for accessibility. So if you could all just kind of rate yourselves when it comes to accessibility. It looks like we're pretty middle of the road here. The second one is really bunching up there in the middle. And I see the first one, we kind of have a tail end to the left, so strongly disagreeing. So kind of a range of accessibility knowledge. Okay, so we're starting to see some more, always very good.
And the code is up at the top of the screen in case you needed that.
Yes, my apologies. The code is 6994856. Apologies, everyone. Okay, so we have about, people are some knowledge of accessibility, which is very good to see. Some newer people, good for us. Okay, I think I'm gonna go, it's still changing. We'll give it just a couple more seconds. All right, the accessibility knowledge is really all over the place, and then evaluating and making sure. We definitely see some people who strongly disagree. So we have some people who are not familiar. That's good to know. All right, so I'm gonna go back to the presentation now. So just so we're all on the same page, what we mean by accessibility, and we are specifically talking about web accessibility, we use the definition by the World Wide Web Consortium. Web accessibility means that websites, tools, and technologies are designed and developed so that people with disabilities can use them. And the World Wide Web Consortium does include people with all types of disabilities. These can be visual, audible, cognitive, physical disabilities. And it doesn't just necessarily mean screen readers. It's any tool that allows people to interact with websites. There's other assistive technology as well. So why accessibility is important? We found this quote to be really, we thought a good summation of one of the most important reasons. When OER are created with faulty assumptions of students' mental and physical abilities, OER become part of a larger social problem that systematically excludes students with disabilities from equal education. And really, we just want to point this out because, the OER movement is very fond of talking about how we do break down barriers to education. We make it so anyone is able to access educational material without a financial burden, but there are other still barriers there. And certainly for disabled people, accessibility can be a huge barrier. And if we're not being mindful of accessibility in OERs, if we're not designing them to be accessible, then there's a significant portion of our users who we're not serving and we're not helping. There are other reasons. Here in the United States, we have a clear legal mandate between the Americans with Disabilities Act and Section 508. These were both really probably more in mind with the in-person accessibility requirements, but courts have certainly interpreted them to mean web accessibility as well. And because of this, there have been many lawsuits against lots of organizations, including universities. And that was true for us here at UNR. A few years ago, we were sued. We did sign a consent decree. It does seem to be a pretty strict consent decree compared with some other universities. But because of this, we really can't provide any publicly facing material, including to our students, if it's not accessible. And because of this, this has been a big hurdle for us in getting an OER program going. So that's really what spurred this research project we did, because we kind of wanted to get a feel out, for what the status of accessibility in open textbooks is. So when it comes to accessibility, what's kind of become the gold standard for evaluating accessibility or determining are the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG, which were created by the World Wide Web Consortium. The most recent version is 2.1. There have been two previous versions, 2.0, which was released in about 2008, and then 1.0. There are 3 levels to web accessibility, or to the WCAG guidelines. So the most basic level is A, and you always have to meet level A, and then you can build up to meeting level 2 or level AA, 2, and then to level AAA. So the methodology for our project, we started with creating a rubric that we did based on WCAG. And we determined that we would do the newest one, WCAG 2.1. It's not always the most commonly used, but there were a lot of really important updates that are really important nowadays for people. And we decided we wanted our books to meet level AA, which means they also must meet level A. We only had 16 categories, which, if you're familiar with WCAG, is pretty small. The WCAG is much bigger than 16 categories. But for various reasons, we decided that's what we're going to focus on. The biggest one, we really wanted to focus on the content that was under the control of OER authors. So a lot of the WCAG rules are really something that's more web developer focused. And because most authors, we were assuming, are using authoring tools, whether it's Google Docs or something like Pressbooks, that's going to be outside of their control. And so we really wanted to focus on what was under the control of the author. We also excluded audio video categories. We're just finding that most textbooks are very much like a traditional textbook. They're not really including audio and video, and that was just a lot more time intensive to do. There's some technical things that made it harder for us to evaluate those or feel comfortable evaluating those. So we excluded those. We also should note that our 16 categories did not apply to all of the formats we studied. I think the most categories that applied to one format were 15. So we don't actually ever have 16 categories per one format. We also did include one AAA category, which was ordered headings. So if you're not familiar, when you're writing in Word, you'll notice often you can do preset formats for, say, heading 1 or heading 2 or heading 3. And accessibility, it's really important that you use those in the proper order. So 1, 2 should always follow 1, 3 should always follow 2, etc. It makes it harder for people to quickly navigate a document if they don't have ordered headings. And we decided to include that one AAA category because it is so easy for people to do, and it's something that is very meaningful when you're needing it. We did all this in collaboration with our accessibility coordinator at our university. We're very fortunate. He is part of the library. And we did several rounds of testing to make sure that this all made sense. And that involved both of us, our accessibility coordinator, and our student worker. And then finally, for our rubric, it was a simple pass-fail. We didn't track the number of times something might have failed a specific category. If it failed once, we marked it as fail and moved on from that category. So here are rubric categories, just kind of quickly. So did the image have an alternative text for non-visual readers? And did the alt text make sense? That's also really important. Were all the elements properly coded or tagged? Was it tagged as a heading or a paragraph or as a caption or something like that? Were lists properly created and tables properly created? Did you use descriptive link text instead of using a long URL for a link? Same for headings. Did you properly use the headings, as I talked about before? For PDFs, were they tagged? Do they have to be tagged if they're going to be accessible? Did the document have a set language? That seems really easy, but doesn't always happen. Was the color contrast? Was there enough contrast for all sighted users to be able to distinguish? No images of text except as needed. So don't take a screenshot of, say, a table and use that. It's not accessible. Don't rely on visual clues formatting to convey information. So don't rely on color to convey information, essentially. It has an appropriate title. The content, again, is worded to make sense. They don't use incorrect HTML code that is outdated, and links are tagged to enable tabbing for PDF. So those were our categories. Our study sample, we randomly selected 393 open textbook links from SUNY Genesio's OASIS database. For those of you not familiar, it's an aggregator of OERs essentially. We specifically decided to focus on HTML/websites, EPUBs, PDFs, and Word documents. Those were just by far the most common open textbook formats that we found. We did not include anything that say was a broken link. Links broke really fast, we discovered. That wasn't actually a textbook, say maybe it was like a worksheet or like another format. So we didn't do Google Documents because they just have some problems. So that took us down to about 355 textbooks that we ended up evaluating. And we just evaluated, just for time's sake, we looked at the first 20 pages of each textbook. Give me a moment, Elena. Okay. No, wait, sorry.
So as Teresa mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we did get a grant from ACRL. And basically what we used that grant money for primarily was to hire a student assistant to help us with this evaluation, because we did it all pretty much manually. And Teresa and I might still be working on this to this day if we didn't have a student to help us. And it took about 5 months total. So we did this in spring, early summer of this year. And we had weekly check-ins with our student to make sure all of us were on the same page. And we were, and you know, our student was rating things the way we had discussed as we work through things. And we kept our data in just a big Excel file that we used to design our rubric. So we did a lot of the tabulations there. And although it was a manual check, so we can make sure that, you know, people are providing alt text for images, for example, that make sense to a human reader, we relied on a lot of different tools to help us. Most of these are fairly free or free. Some were particular to certain formats. So like Cite and Prove is for websites versus like Adobe Acrobat Pro is what we use for PDFs. And you can see some tools here that are newer that we used for EPUBs. But then some we used across all the books. So like a screen reader is what we used whenever we weren't sure how something might be interpreted by a screen reader. So NVDA was the one our student used that was free. And then we also use something called the Color Contrast Analyzer, which is a free tool that helps you evaluate whether your background and your foreground colors contrast enough to meet accessibility standards.
Oh, just one thing to point out, we did discover in the middle of this through our accessibility coordinator that while Microsoft Word has an accessibility checker, it's kind of actually not great, we discovered, which is why we use the Color Contrast Analyzer.
Yeah, so some of these are better than others, but it was kind of a patchwork of different tools throughout the whole thing. And in terms of results, so as Teresa said, we had 355 books that we ended up using in our sample set. And this is kind of the breakdown of what they were by format. So 99 of those were a file, like HTML files or websites that you could read online. 124 were PDFs, 23 were Word docs, and 109 were EPUBs. And when things were available in multiple formats, we tended to evaluate them first if they had HTML or EPUB versions. And then if all they had left was PDF or Word doc, that's what we moved to. So what we end up doing is we looked at each book and how many passes and how many fails it received in each, it received in terms of all the categories. So there were 16 categories, but not every category was something you could use for each of the formats. So for example, PDFs could be rated in 15 categories, EPUBs only 14, but about 14 to 16 categories for each item. And so we looked at the average number of passes for each book. So that was across the whole sample set, regardless of format, 7.52, and the median was about 8 passes. On the flip side of that, there was about, each book had almost 6 fails and a median number of about 6 fails. And then, of course, we had our data, like what categories in our rubric did the books pass or fail the most in. And so on one side, we have here the top 3 passes and then the fails. And those percentages are how many passed in one case or how many failed of the entire 355. So the 3 passes, the categories that we got the most passes in were uses descriptive headings and labels. Information is not only conveyed in the formatting of text or other visual cues, and is the content ordered to make sense? And I think we would argue that some of these things are just things, you know, OER authors are probably doing to make their text more readable. It's not necessarily something that you would do like content ordering just for accessibility. But we got pretty great pass rates in that, I would say. And then in terms of what categories these books failed in the most, one of the ones we were sad to see was that images didn't have alt text, or if they didn't, they were marked as decorative. So 80% of the books failed that in some way. And then tables was a big problem for a lot of these books. Almost 80% failed in making their tables accessible. And then also there's a problem with just coding. So HTML code tags, or, there's also an issue with PDF tagging. So, in a PDF tagged as a heading or a paragraph or a link. So if you're using a screen reader, you could tell what you were landing on as you were going through the text. And then we also wanted to look at fails by format. So these are the 4 different formats and the average amount of fails books in that format had. So 5.3 for HTML, 7.42 for PDF, 4.95 for EPUB, and 5.26 for Word. So they all kind of hovered around 5, except for PDFs there. They did a little bit worse. And then we also wanted to take a look to see, just kind of in these different categories, where there are books that performed really well. So these are the numbers for in each type of format, how many books had 3 or fewer fails out of the total 14 to 16. And you can see, again, PDFs didn't do as well. Only about 6.5% of those books had 3 or fewer fails. HTML, almost 20% there. EPUBs, almost a quarter of them, and then Word, about 20%. And I will say that there were very, very few books in the sample set that passed all the categories. Only 2, and they were both EPUBs, for what that's worth. And so we kind of think the implications of this is that there's not a lot of attention being paid to basic accessibility practices, it seems, to things like just providing alt text for images and making sure your tables are okay. So we think more training and support is needed for the content creators, but also for anyone who might be using these OERs if you want to remediate. And that, even though PDFs seem to do a little worse, it mostly seemed like the format didn't really make a difference. So like using a particular format didn't make it easier or harder. It seems to be more accessible. Though certainly certain tools have built-in ways that you can just make things accessible. If you use some of Word's tools, for example, to make headings and label them as such, you might be better off, but it didn't really seem to make a difference here. And that also not everything is always under the author's control, even though we tried with our rubric to pick categories that we thought would be something the authors could control.
For example, on that one, I've been playing with Pressbooks, and while you can within like your document say, okay, I want the top one to be a heading 1, that's actually problematic because when you use the templates, the template I chose, the chapter number, which comes very first, was like a heading 3. And so you have a heading 3 and then a heading 1, which is inaccessible. So sometimes it's just, again, it's the platform. You are at the mercy of the platform. So we would also really encourage, advocacy with these platforms to make sure that these are accessible. And we have 2 minutes before Q&A, but so we could probably just jump to Q&A, to be honest. But we also thought, might be nice to try and start a discussion if people have thoughts as well. So we're interested in hearing, for those who are working with accessibility and open textbooks, what tips do you have for evaluating them for accessibility? And then what has your experience been, if you have any, with various platforms when trying to create an accessible textbook?
Oh, and I will say, I should mention this when we were going through the results. We did mark things that just didn't have the thing where, like, if they had no tables, we marked it as a not applicable on our rubric. But the percentages, we took those out, and we just looked at things that passed or failed. So to clarify that.
And I'm not able to see the chat screen, so.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. Yeah, we do have quite a few questions in the chat. Great questions related to your presentation. And let me know if you aren't able to see the chat, if you would like me to read the question.
I cannot. So someone else, Elena, you will need to read it for me. I'm sorry.
Did some organizations and repositories seem to do better than others?
We didn't, unfortunately, track that.
No, and just kind of thinking back on it, I don't think that was the case.
There were some, I remember, where there were specific problems that just kept popping up, and that was likely because of the platform itself. I remember, I think some were using Wiki, and evidently they're still using the old I code for italics instead of emphasis. And that was just across the board. Yeah, a fail. Other questions, Elena?
A question about, let's see, I'm trying to go back to the top. How many books evaluated total? So yeah, 355 ended up being evaluated. We picked up 393, and they came from all over. So Oasis is just an aggregator. So we got stuff from Pressbooks, from LibreText, from OpenStax, and some just from university repositories and websites. So it was from all over. Non-decorative was not considered a fail, to clarify that, but they had to mark it as such, so that someone using a screen reader would know that it was something they could ignore. If they had it there, we can assume that they meant to have it be decorative. And we did stay clear of anything that was like a logo for, say, the aggregator or the platform. We just assume that's not in the control of the developer or the author. A question about what is a tagged PDF?
So yeah, it's PDFs are not great for accessibility, to be quite perfectly honest. You have to tag an HTML or PDF document almost like you do an HTML website with HTML code. So when you're on a website, you would have header tags or header codes, like around a header, and paragraph codes around a paragraph, and it's something similar for PDF. So you have to tell PDF has to know this is a paragraph, this is a header, this is an image with alt text, this is a table, this is a list. So it's just a system to tell Adobe or other PDF readers what each element in a document is. It's a tough thing to do if you're doing it from scratch.
What is the threshold for you to accept a text for use in a course based on the rubric?
So our university's accessibility, I think, right, Elena, we're actually 2.0 level A is what we're at.
So ideally, you'd pass all these categories or find a way to remediate the book if you're going to use it.
Each university has, if they have a policy, they have their own. There's no one like national or international accepted level.
We didn't do a comparative study for commercial textbooks, but that is an excellent idea.
There have been actually other studies done looking at the accessibility of just ebooks in general. So there are other studies out there. We were interested specifically in open textbooks just because we weren't able to find that information.
Can we share a rubric? Yeah, we'll share these slides too, but we can do that.
We do, I think, right, Elena, we're actually working on a draft of an article right now, so we are hoping to publish this, and the rubric would be part of that as well, hopefully, fingers crossed.
And hopefully we'll provide this as open data too when we're done.
Yes. Yeah, I think there's no reason we shouldn't be able to share our data set.
If we are training faculty to create OER, do you have recommended best practices for when during that process to train them in accessibility?
So honestly, our university is already big on accessibility training. It's something we have to do every year. Our teaching and learning technologies department is part of the library. That's how we have the accessibility coordinator, and they already offer a lot of training. So for us, it's not something we've really done yet, but early before they start making, because it's only going to be harder to make something accessible after the fact. That's what I would suggest.
And a question.
Oh, sorry, this is Rachel. So at this point, we are at time. And so I am going to stop the recording, but everyone is welcome. Just stop it.